So if you take the entire continental United States, China, India, Japan, and like almost all of Europe, you can actually fit them entirely inside the continent of Africa.
Right. Simultaneously.
Simultaneously, with room to spare. So the question is, why did the map in your third grade classroom lie to you? And I guess more importantly, if the physical scale of an entire continent was literally shrunk down in your mind, what else was minimized?
Yeah, I mean, it forces a total recalibration of how you view the world. When you realize the visual representation you grew up with is fundamentally distorted, you have to start asking, what other distortions have been presented to you as objective fact.
Exactly. So welcome to this deep dive. Today you are embarking on a really profound exploration into the machinery of global history. We're unpacking a massive stack of sources today: historical texts, archaeological summaries, botanical records, critical analysis.
It's a lot of material.
It's a mountain of material. And we're looking at how Western institutions historically appropriated, minimized, or just completely erased African intellectual contributions. We are basically talking about the hidden architects of the modern world.
And because we are diving into deeply charged themes here, colonialism, institutional power, the historical construction of race, it is really important to clarify our approach right at the top.
Right.
We are essentially doing an audit of the historical ledger. We aren't here to endorse a specific modern political ideology or to take sides. Our job today is to strictly follow the paper trail, the material evidence, and the shifting scholarly consensus detailed in these sources.
Yeah, we are acting as impartial messengers for the research, examining how the narrative of human progress was actually engineered. We are just reading the receipts.
It's just reading the receipts.
And honestly, looking at these receipts, I am just blown away by the sheer scale of the historical redaction. We aren't talking about a forgotten inventor here or there.
No, not at all.
The version of history most of us were taught, that neat, straight, incredibly crisp line that goes from ancient Greece to Rome to the European Enlightenment and straight into modernity, it's missing massive foundational chapters. So we are going to set the stage for a journey of unlearning and relearning for you today.
And to do that effectively, we have to look through the lens of historiography.
Okay, define that for us.
Right. So for anyone unfamiliar with the term, historiography isn't just the study of historical events. It is the study of how history itself is written.
Like the history of history.
Exactly. It asks the structural questions. Who gets to hold the pen? What evidence do those institutions consider valid? What are their cultural blind spots? History is never just a list of facts floating in a vacuum. It's a curated story.
Right, and the people curating it have their own agendas.
Precisely. And for centuries, the institutions empowered to define what constituted civilization, evidence, and expertise were largely created by societies that were actively extracting resources from Africa. That power dynamic didn't just influence the story, it fundamentally dictated it.
I want to stick with that map analogy we started with, because before we can even begin to understand how African intellectual scale was diminished, we have to look at how its physical scale was systematically shrunk in our minds. Let's redraw the map.
Let's do it.
I mentioned the true geographic size of Africa earlier. It is approximately 30.37 million square kilometers. That is about 11.7 million square miles.
The visual disconnect between that true massive size and the maps we grew up with is almost entirely due to the Mercator projection.
Okay, so the Mercator projection, where does that come from?
This was a map created by the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator in 1569. The mechanism of this map is vital to understand because it wasn't created for, elementary school geography. It was a highly specialized tool designed specifically for marine navigation.
Wait, how does a navigational tool end up shrinking an entire continent? Walk me through the actual math of what Mercator was doing.
Sure. So imagine a transparent globe of the Earth, and you put a light bulb in the dead center.
Okay, got it.
Now, imagine wrapping a flat cylinder of paper around that globe so the paper only actually touches the glass right at the equator.
Like a paper towel tube around a tennis ball.
Perfect analogy, yes. If you turn on the light bulb, the shadows of the continents are projected out onto the paper. Near the equator, where the paper touches the glass, the shapes and sizes are highly accurate.
Because there's no distance for the light to travel.
Right. But as you look further north or south toward the poles, the light has to travel further to hit the paper, so the shadows stretch out.
Oh, I see. So the further you get from the equator, the more the land masses get artificially inflated on the paper.
That is the core distortion. But Mercator did this intentionally because it preserves compass bearings, which sailors call rum lines.
Rum lines.
Yeah. The genius of the Mercator projection is that if a 16th century sailor drew a perfectly straight line on that map from the coast of Spain to the West Indies, they could set their compass to that exact heading, never adjust it, and arrive at their destination. Yeah, the latitude and longitude lines intersect at perfect 90-degree right angles, creating a flat, reliable grid.
Which is an incredible piece of mathematical engineering if you are trying not to crash a galleon into a reef. But what happens to the size of the countries?
Well, because Africa lies heavily across the equator, its true size remains relatively preserved on the map. But places in the higher latitudes like Europe, North America, and Greenland are massively stretched.
So they look huge by comparison.
Exactly. On a standard Mercator map, Greenland looks roughly the same size as Africa. But in physical reality, Africa is about 14 times larger than Greenland.
That is staggering. It's like a funhouse mirror that got permanently installed in every classroom in the world.
It really is.
But here's the thing that really bothers me about this. You have this mathematical tool meant to keep ships afloat, and it transitions into a culturally dominant educational standard. If you think about it, visual distortion directly primes people to accept intellectual distortion.
Absolutely it does.
Right. Like, if I am a kid looking at a map every day, and Europe looks massive, central, and dominant, and Africa looks shrunken and peripheral, that does something to my subconscious.
The sources actually refer to this phenomenon as ideological geography. The original map wasn't inherently malicious, right? Mercator wasn't sitting in his study trying to make a geopolitical statement about racial hierarchy. He was solving a geometry problem for sailors.
He just wanted people to not get lost at sea.
Right. But the persistent, uncritical use of that map in classrooms over centuries helped naturalize a global hierarchy in the minds of millions of people.
Because seeing is believing.
Seeing is the baseline of reality. Generations of students repeatedly saw the global north visually dominating the space on the wall. It appeared large, central, and significant. Meanwhile, the massive continent of Africa appeared compact, fragmented, and secondary.
So it's backing up the political narrative.
Exactly. It visually reinforced a narrative of European centrality that was simultaneously being pushed through colonial politics, education, and racial ideology. The map just became a silent partner in the narrative.
It's the ultimate subtle bias. You don't even know you're being taught a hierarchy because you think you're just looking at objective geography.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder about modern technology,
How so?
Well, when you open Google Earth today, or really any digital mapping software, you are looking at a 3D globe. You can spin it, tilt it, and see the true relative sizes of the continents based on satellite data.
That's a great point.
Right. I have to speculate that this might be slowly correcting the subconscious bias for the next generation. If you grow up spinning a digital globe instead of staring at a stretched Mercator projection on a wall, your baseline understanding of the world's physical reality changes.
And that physical unshrinking is a perfect conceptual bridge to the intellectual unshrinking detailed in our sources. Because once you realize the landmass is incredibly vast, it becomes much harder to mentally sideline the intellectual output of the billions of people who lived on it over millennia.
Which moves us from mapping the land to mapping the human body. Let's talk about the stolen blueprint. Now that we understand the physical minimizing of the continent, the sources outline how foundational scientific and medical contributions were systematically conceptually detached from it.
And we have to start with ancient Egypt to understand that, also known as Kemet.
Kemet, right.
Yep.
So what do the sources say about Kemet?
The historical and archaeological consensus from the sources we are looking at is very clear. Ancient Egypt was fundamentally an African civilization, and its innovations were staggering.
It was massive.
The level of societal organization required to build the monuments they did implies a highly advanced mastery of mathematics, geometry, and surveying. They were utilizing complex fractional calculations for engineering, managing a professional bureaucracy with sophisticated taxation systems, and organizing large-scale agricultural censuses.
But the thing that really stands out in the research, the thing that I think totally shatters the conventional timeline of science that we're taught, is the medical knowledge, specifically the Edwin Smith Papyrus.
Yes, the Edwin Smith Papyrus is a fascinating document. It dates back to around 1600 BCE, though it is actually believed to be a copy of a much older text, potentially from around 2500 BCE.
So we are talking over 4,000 years ago.
Easily. And historians recognize this not as a book of magic or, spiritual incantations, but as one of the world's earliest known scientific medical texts. It is a deeply rational, analytical document.
When you say analytical, what does that actually look like in practice? Because I think we have a tendency to picture ancient medicine as just rubbing some herbs on a cut and hoping for the best.
It is far, far beyond that. The papyrus details 48 specific clinical cases.
Wait, 48 specific cases, like a modern medical journal.
Exactly like that. For each case, the physician outlines the examination process, the diagnosis, the treatment, and the prognosis. They are essentially using the modern scientific method. For example, it contains some of the earliest recorded observations of the human brain.
Really?
Yeah. The text describes the brain's surface, noting the convolutions, the ridges, and wrinkles on the outside of the brain.
Wait, they were performing brain surgery thousands of years ago.
They were dealing with severe trauma, likely from construction accidents on monuments or from warfare. There is a famous case in the papyrus, case 6, which describes a gaping wound in the head with the skull smashed open, exposing the brain.
Oh, wow. Brutal.
Very. And the physician instructs the reader to palpate the wound, noting that the brain throbs and flutters under the fingers like the weak spot on a baby's head before the skull fuses.
That is incredibly descriptive.
It is. They recognized the meninges, the membranes enveloping the brain. They also mapped out the correlation between specific head injuries and paralysis on the opposite side of the body.
Nate, so they understood localized neurological function?
They absolutely did. And their treatments were highly practical, too. They used sutures to close wounds. They applied raw meat to stop bleeding, which contains natural clotting agents.
I had no idea about the raw meal. That's wild.
It works. And they used honey and copper salts to treat infections, which we now know create an osmotic effect that pulls water out of bacterial cells, basically dehydrating and killing them.
Okay, so you have this incredibly advanced scientific, medical, and engineering powerhouse. And geographically, Egypt is in Africa. The Nile flows through Africa. The civilization arose through immense interaction, trade, and cultural exchange with Nubia, the Sahara, and other distinct African regions.
All true.
But the historiographical tactic used by Western scholars for a very long time was to conceptually sever Egypt from the rest of the continent.
Yeah. Popular Western history routinely categorized Egypt as Mediterranean or Middle Eastern, or as this sort of universal, isolated miracle that just sprang up in the sand with no organic connection to the African continent beneath it.
I am really struggling with the mental gymnastics here. If Egypt is literally attached to the continent and the Nile flows northward through it, how did the academic establishment manage to effectively Photoshop it into Europe's origin story? How do they justify that on paper?
The justification was rooted in necessity. That conceptual removal served a vital ideological purpose. Western history desperately wanted to claim ancient Egypt as a foundational civilization, the grand precursor to Greece and Rome.
Because they needed an origin story.
Right. But during the 18th and 19th centuries, colonial racial theories were being heavily codified to justify the transatlantic slave trade and imperial expansion across Africa. And those racial theories relied entirely on the premise of inherent African intellectual stagnation.
So you have a massive contradiction.
An insurmountable cognitive dissonance. You cannot simultaneously argue that African people are inherently incapable of complex civilization, science, and governance, while also acknowledging that one of the most magnificent ancient civilizations on Earth was fundamentally African.
Right. That breaks the whole model.
Exactly. So the intellectual solution to this problem was simply to weaken Egypt's African identity in the textbooks.
So they kept the pyramids, they kept the math, and they kept the honey and copper wound care, but they conceptually evicted the creators from their own continent.
That's a good way to put it.
And this ties directly into the historical relationship between Greek intellectuals and Egyptian knowledge, right? Because the Greeks themselves didn't hide this.
They did not. Ancient Greek writers were actually quite open about their reverence for Egyptian knowledge. Foundational figures of Western thought people like Solon, Pythagoras, Plato, and Herodotus, they all traveled to Egypt to study.
Like a study abroad program.
Basically, Herodotus, who is often called the father of history in the West, explicitly described Egypt as a highly learned ancient civilization that heavily influenced the Greeks.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second. How much did the Greeks actually take? Are we talking about a few mathematical concepts or wholesale copying? Because I know that is a deeply contentious area in the research.
The sources present a very nuanced view of this debate. You have African-centered scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop who argue for heavy, direct borrowing of Egyptian philosophy, science, and religious concepts by the Greeks.
Okay. And the other side?
On the other hand, mainstream Western historians often debate the exact extent of that direct copying, arguing that the Greeks synthesized those ideas into something distinct.
Because so much of the original Egyptian papyrus record is just lost to time, right?
Exactly. The loss of primary documents makes precise line-by-line attribution across centuries very difficult. However, the text maintains a neutral, overarching stance on the absolute degree of borrowing, noting that regardless of the exact percentage, all scholars fundamentally agree on one crucial point.
Which is?
Egypt was highly sophisticated in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and engineering long before classical Greece ever emerged. The Greek foundational thinkers were absolutely looking south across the Mediterranean for their education.
It just takes a staggering amount of systemic effort to ignore the fact that the fathers of Western philosophy basically went to Africa for boarding school.
It really does.
But this extraction of knowledge wasn't just an ancient phenomenon, right? It didn't stop with the Greeks. It became highly systematized and institutionalized during the colonial era, which moves us from the ancient world to the botanical and geographical erasure of the 18th and 19th centuries.
This is where we see a very specific formalized mechanism of erasure. During the expansion of colonial empires, European medical researchers, botanists, and explorers traveled extensively throughout Africa.
And they were totally out of their element.
Completely. The environments they were entering were, to them, incredibly hostile. They faced novel tropical diseases, unfamiliar terrain, and unknown flora. So to survive and actually conduct their research, they relied heavily on indigenous African healers and guides.
And these local practitioners weren't just guessing. They had deep, generational, empirical knowledge, right?
They possessed highly sophisticated knowledge systems. African healers understood the local ecology intimately. They knew the precise pharmacological properties of medicinal plants.
Like what kind of properties?
They had established treatments for tropical fevers, sophisticated wound care, obstetrics, and the use of natural anesthetics and antiseptics. They knew which specific bark to boil, which root to grind, and the exact dosages required to treat a patient without poisoning them.
It's precise pharmacology.
Exactly.
But when you go into a modern university library and read the historical scientific literature from that era, you don't see those African names in the citations.
The African names are almost entirely absent. And here is the publishing mechanism that facilitated that erasure. A European scientist would arrive, observe an indigenous healer successfully treating a disease with a specific plant, and learn the preparation method.
Okay.
The scientist would then collect a sample of that plant, bring it back to Europe, and run it through the newly established Linnean taxonomy system.
Wait, explain the Linnean system for me.
Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish botanist who formalized the modern system of naming organisms called binomial nomenclature. It is the system where every plant and animal gets a two-part Latin name, like Homo sapiens.
Oh, okay. Genus and species.
Right. So the European scientist takes this African plant, gives it a formal Latin scientific name, publishes a paper on its medicinal properties in a European journal, and credits themselves as the collector or discoverer.
Wow. It reminds me of a modern-day patent troll.
A patent troll?
Yeah. You know those corporate entities that scour the internet, find an existing open-source community innovation that people have been using for years, and they just slap a trademark on it, file a patent, and legally claim they invented it? The European scientists basically took centuries of indigenous trial and error, slapped a Latin name on it, and declared themselves the discoverers.
That patent troll analogy is highly accurate. They were legally and academically fencing off knowledge that was communally developed, and the exact same mechanism was used in geography.
Oh, with the maps again.
Yes. Consider explorers like John Hanning Speke and Richard Francis Burton. In Western history, they are famous for discovering the source of the Nile and mapping Central Africa in the 19th century.
I've always found the word discover in this context hilarious. I mean, you can't discover a massive lake if millions of people already live on the shores of it, fish in it, and know exactly where it is.
Exactly. Speke and Burton did not wander into the wilderness and find these geographical features by themselves. They relied entirely on massive caravans of African guides, interpreters, porters, and the logistical support of local rulers.
So the maps already existed in the minds of the locals.
Yes. The geographical information they recorded, the routes, the locations of lakes, the river systems, was already well known and mapped in the minds of the local communities.
The sources also talk about the Khoisan people in southern Africa. How did their knowledge get appropriated?
Well, the Khoisan peoples had an unparalleled mastery of survival in some of the most arid, challenging environments on Earth. European settlers and explorers learned extensively from them about tracking, animal behavior, identifying edible and medicinal plants, and finding hidden water sources in the desert.
Now, tracking sounds like a physical skill, but reading about it in these sources, it is deeply scientific.
It is the ultimate applied science. A Khoisan tracker isn't just looking at a footprint in the dirt. They are looking at the way a specific blade of grass is bent.
That's incredible.
They are observing whether the morning dew has been knocked off the leaves at a certain height. They are examining animal droppings and observing which specific insects have arrived to feed on it, because certain beetles only arrive after a certain number of hours.
So it's basically a natural clock?
Yes, they are listening to the alarm calls of specific bird species. It is a real-time mastery of entomology, botany, hydrology, and ecology.
So my question is, what were the structural factors that allowed this erasure? If a British doctor brings a botanical cure back to London, wouldn't the medical board ask where he got it? How did the academic establishment just accept this massive plagiarism without anyone blowing the whistle?
It comes down to the established norms of European academic publishing and the inherent power dynamics of colonialism. First, the structure of academic publishing credited the lead author or the patron who financed the expedition.
Oh, I see.
The idea of listing an indigenous healer as a co-author was unthinkable to them. Second, colonial attitudes viewed African experts merely as informants.
What is the distinction there?
Well, if an African healer showed a British doctor a cure for a fever, the British doctor did not see himself as a student learning from a professor. He saw himself as the objective scientist observing a primitive curiosity. The healer was viewed as part of the flora and fauna, not as an intellectual peer.
That is incredibly condescending.
It was. And finally, there was the systemic institutional bias regarding oral knowledge.
Right, because European academia absolutely idolized the written word. If it wasn't written down in a leather-bound journal, it wasn't considered rigorous.
Precisely. Indigenous knowledge systems were largely transmitted orally through apprenticeships, practical demonstration, and memorized taxonomies. Therefore, European institutions deemed them inherently inferior and unscientific.
So just thrown out.
Right. This structural bias allowed progressive botanical and geographical discoveries to be seamlessly credited to Western civilization, while African intellectual production was denied, detached from its creators, or treated as just derivative folklore.
Okay, so medical knowledge and maps are relatively easy to steal. You steal a leaf, you redraw a line, you rewrite the label in Latin. But massive physical structures pose a very different problem for colonial narratives.
They certainly do.
How do you erase something made of stone that is hundreds of feet across and staring you right in the face? You can't put a monument in your pocket and take it back to London. This brings us to the myth of the outsider, and specifically, the incredible case study of Great Zimbabwe.
Great Zimbabwe is perhaps one of the most revealing historical examples of cognitive dissonance in the colonial record.
Tell me about the scale of it.
It is an enormous complex of stone structures located in the modern country of Zimbabwe, built roughly between the 11th and 15th centuries. At its peak, it was a major historic urban center, a thriving metropolis that controlled vast trade networks stretching all the way to the Indian Ocean.
Talk to me about the engineering here, because the ruins aren't just a pile of rocks.
No, the engineering is extraordinary. The most famous structure is the Great Enclosure, which features massive outer walls reaching up to 11 meters, about 36 feet high. And these are dry stone walls. They were built entirely without mortar to bind them.
Wait, how do you build a wall 36 feet high out of stone without any cement or mortar holding it together?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it just collapse under its own weight?
It requires immense architectural precision. The builders quarried local granite, which naturally fractures in straight lines when heated and rapidly cooled. They carefully shaped these uniform rectangular blocks.
Okay, so they had perfectly shaped blocks, but still, no mortar.
To give the walls stability without mortar, they use a technique called battering. The walls are much wider at the base than at the top, naturally leaning inward slightly to distribute the immense weight of the stone downward rather than outward.
That is brilliant.
And they also incorporated incredible aesthetic details, like intricate chevron patterns woven into the top courses of the stone walls. It is a masterpiece of civil engineering.
So imagine the scene. European writers and explorers in the late 19th century are trekking through the landscape, and they suddenly encountered these massive, precision-engineered stone ruins. What was their reaction?
Their documented reaction was immediate, flat denial. They looked at the sophisticated architecture, the scale of the city, the complex drainage systems, and they explicitly refused to believe that the local Black African societies could have built it.
I really want you, the listener, to grasp the sheer absurdity of this reaction. Imagine walking into a beautifully constructed, complex home in a neighborhood you've never been to.
Yeah.
The architecture is stunning. You meet the people who live in the neighborhood, the descendants of the people who built the home, and you look them dead in the eye and decide, no, ghosts must have built this.
Right.
Or maybe some ancient sailors who got lost. Because I simply don't think you are smart enough to stack these stones. It is a level of ideological delusion that is almost hard to fathom.
It was a profound delusion. And to maintain it, they had to invent systemic methods to explain the ruins away. European writers and amateur archaeologists began attributing the complex to literally anyone else.
Anyone but the locals.
Anyone. They claimed it was built by ancient Phoenicians or Arab traders or even biblical figures. A very popular theory was that it was the lost city of Ophir, where the biblical queen of Sheba supposedly got her gold.
So they reached into biblical mythology rather than just accepting the physical evidence right in front of them.
Yes. And this is where we need to critically deconstruct the word debated as it often appears in older historical texts.
What do you mean?
Well, for a long time, Western textbooks would say the origins of Great Zimbabwe were debated. But this wasn't a genuine scholarly debate based on incomplete evidence. It wasn't two groups of modern archaeologists looking at carbon dating and disagreeing on a century.
Right, it wasn't a scientific disagreement.
No, it was a refusal to accept material evidence solely because that evidence contradicted the ideological expectation of white supremacy.
The evidence was literally written in stone, but the colonial mindset couldn't process it.
One side of the debate began with the material evidence on the ground. The other side began with the unshakable premise that Africans were intellectually incapable of monumental architecture.
And modern archaeology obviously settled this.
Completely. Modern archaeology, through radiocarbon dating, stratigraphy, and the analysis of local pottery and tools found at the foundation levels, has firmly and unequivocally established that Great Zimbabwe was the creation of local Shona-speaking societies.
So the debate is dead.
Even institutions like the British Museum now definitively describe it as one of southern Africa's most important historic urban centers. The colonial narrative of the outsider has been completely overturned.
But the denial of African ability wasn't just about massive stone buildings. It extended to a denial of written and institutional scholarship, which leads us to the invisibility of African academics. Let's move from Southern Africa up to West Africa and talk about invisible scholars and ignored libraries. We have to talk about Timbuktu.
Yes. The historical texts we are examining detail the immense scholarly output of the West African empires, specifically Ghana, Mali, and Songhai.
And this is where we get to the legendary wealth too, right?
Exactly. During the reign of the Mali Empire, the wealth was legendary. You have historical figures like Mansa Musa, whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 famously distributed so much gold that it actually destabilized local economies in the Middle East for years.
He literally caused inflation on his vacation.
He did. But while the gold gets the headlines, it was the intellectual capital that was truly staggering. Long before many European universities even existed, the city of Timbuktu became a massive international center of scholarship.
The sources mention hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. This wasn't just a few scrolls hidden in a cave somewhere. What exactly were they studying in these libraries?
Timbuktu was a thriving academic hub built around institutions like the Sankore University. Professional scholars were teaching students from across Africa and the broader Islamic world. The surviving manuscripts cover an incredibly broad range of disciplines.
Like what?
They were studying astronomy, tracking planetary movements and lunar cycles, which was essential for navigating the trans-Saharan trade routes. They studied medicine, Islamic jurisprudence, philosophy, theology, and literature.
Were they doing high-level math?
Yes, heavily. They had texts on complex mathematics and algorithms, specifically applied to commercial law. When you are managing vast trade networks dealing in gold, salt, and textiles, you need sophisticated mathematical systems to calculate exchange rates, taxation, and the incredibly complex fractional math required for Islamic inheritance laws.
So you have literal libraries full of math, astronomy, and law. Yet the persistent colonial narrative consistently portrayed Africa as the dark continent, a place with no history. How did European historians justify that narrative when there were literal universities operating for centuries?
They justified it by weaponizing the concept of history itself. Because many African societies transmitted knowledge orally alongside the written traditions, like those in Timbuktu, European historians established a rigid rule.
Rule about what counts as history.
Exactly. They declared that without Western-style written archives, a society possessed no usable historical record. They dismissed rich, complex oral traditions as mere myth, folklore, or campfire stories.
Which is a massive, glaring double standard. Think about Western literature and history. Why was the oral tradition of Homer's Odyssey or the Iliad or Beowulf considered the absolute bedrock of Western civilization and literature, but African oral histories like the Epic of Sundiata, which details the founding of the Mali Empire, were dismissed as unscientific fables?
That is the exact hypocrisy that African scholars and critical historians point out. European history itself depends heavily on oral testimony. Legends, epics, and religious texts were passed down verbally for centuries before ever being codified into writing.
It's just a tool for gatekeeping.
It was a way to gatekeep the very definition of the word history. When African communities utilized rigorous, institutionalized oral history, where griots or specialized historians memorized and transmitted complex lineages, legal precedents, and state histories, it was rejected.
And what happened when European colonizers actually stumbled upon the written history? When they couldn't use the oral tradition excuse because they were staring at hundreds of thousands of written manuscripts in Timbuktu.
When French colonial authorities eventually encountered these massive manuscript collections, they often treated them as colonial discoveries.
There's that word again, discoveries.
Yes. They completely failed to acknowledge the local Malian families who had safeguarded these texts for generations. These local families often hid the manuscripts in the sand, buried them in metal boxes, or sealed them in secret rooms at great personal risk to protect them from invaders and weather.
So the locals are actively protecting the library.
Right. But the colonizers framed it as Europe swooping in to rescue lost knowledge rather than acknowledging an enduring, continuous African intellectual tradition.
It's just exhausting. The mental gymnastics required to keep all these lies afloat. And this brings up the modern effort to fix this. The sources talk about how African scholars were forced to remain professionally invisible for so long, and what it took to finally break that silence.
It required a massive, coordinated international effort to finally correct what had been normalized as universal history. African scholars associated with institutions like CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, and the monumental UNESCO General History of Africa project had to fight aggressively to be heard.
What did that UNESCO project actually entail?
The UNESCO project was a watershed moment. It involved more than 550 African and international experts working over decades. They had to systematically reconstruct African history from African perspectives.
Because the colonial archives were basically tainted.
Exactly. Because the colonial written archives were inherently biased, they had to bypass them. They used modern archaeology, linguistic analysis to trace human migrations, the study of indigenous knowledge systems, and they developed rigorous scientific methods for cross-referencing and validating oral traditions.
They basically had to invent a new way of doing history.
They essentially had to invent a new historical methodology to find the truth.
The fact that it took an international task force of hundreds of experts just to prove that an entire continent has a history, well, it really shows how deeply entrenched the erasure was. So if colonial powers couldn't misattribute a discovery or slap a Latin name on it or ignore it as folklore, they simply took it by force.
They did.
Which leads us to the paradox of the museum: looting genius and the moral implications of restitution. We have to talk about the Kingdom of Benin.
The Kingdom of Benin, located in what is now present-day Nigeria, is a vital case study in this appropriation. The kingdom was renowned globally for its extraordinary metalworking. It is important to note that African societies independently developed iron smelting, steel production, and copper working long before European contact.
Right.
But the bronze and brass works of the Kingdom of Benin are widely regarded by art historians today as absolute, unparalleled masterpieces of global metallurgy.
Walk me through how they actually made these, because it wasn't just pouring liquid metal into a simple cup.
No, they used a highly sophisticated process called the lost wax casting technique. It requires immense technical skill and temperature control. The artist starts by sculpting a core out of clay. Once that dries, they cover it in a thin layer of beeswax.
Okay, wax over clay.
Then the artist carves all the intricate details into the wax, the woven texture of a royal robe, the facial features, the individual beads of a necklace.
So you have a highly detailed wax sculpture over a clay core. What's next?
They cover that delicate wax sculpture in several more layers of fine clay to create an outer mold. They let it dry, and then they fire the entire thing in a kiln.
Okay, so they bake it.
Right. The heat bakes the clay hard, and the wax inside melts and runs out through small channels, hence the term lost wax.
Oh, that makes sense. The wax is lost.
Exactly. What you are left with is a hollow gap, perfectly shaped like the original sculpture. Finally, they pour molten brass or bronze, which requires temperatures over 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit, into that gap.
1,700 degrees. That is serious heat.
It is. Once it cools, they break the outer clay mold, revealing the metal sculpture inside.
That is incredibly complex. It requires an intimate understanding of thermodynamics, metallurgy, and material science. But these artifacts aren't mostly in Nigeria today, are they?
No, they are not. In 1897, a British military expedition invaded Benin City. It was a brutal, punitive expedition. They removed thousands of royal and sacred objects, plaques, sculptures, ceremonial masks, burned large parts of the city to the ground, and looted the artworks.
So they just took everything of value.
They did. These looted works, collectively known as the Benin bronzes, were then shipped back to Europe and distributed through museums, auctions, and private collections across Europe and eventually the United States.
And this creates a profound psychological contradiction, a real paradox at the heart of colonial collecting. I want to highlight the deep moral hypocrisy of the museum model described in these sources.
It is a striking hypocrisy.
The British and Europeans generally looked at these bronzes and were astounded. They admired the technical complexity, the historical detail, the undeniable artistic genius. But they simultaneously depicted the Africans who made them as primitive, savage, and culturally inferior.
That is the core, unresolvable contradiction of the colonial era. The sources explicitly point out how Western institutions could display African genius while totally separating that genius from African sovereignty.
It's like they wanted the art, but not the artist.
Right. When Europeans first saw the bronzes in London, many actually questioned if Africans could have produced them independently. They were desperately looking for an outsider like the Portuguese or ancient Egyptians to credit, just like with Great Zimbabwe.
They couldn't believe what they were seeing.
Right. And when the sheer volume and cultural specificity made it undeniable that Edo artists created them, the narrative violently shifted. The objects suddenly became elevated to the status of World Heritage.
But they only became World Heritage after Europeans possessed them. That is the ultimate irony. A Western museum uses stolen African creations to establish itself as this objective, universal repository of human civilization, while simultaneously propagating narratives in its history and anthropology departments that denied Africans had ever produced civilization in the first place.
Exactly the point. And this is why the current artifact restitution efforts, the modern push to return the Benin bronzes and other looted artifacts to Africa, are so highly charged and philosophically complex.
Because it's not just about the objects.
Restitution is not just about packing up beautiful art, putting it in a crate, and shipping it back. It is fundamentally about challenging persistent colonial narratives. It is a debate about who owns history.
It's about institutional authority.
Yes. For over a century, Western museums gained immense prestige, research authority, tourism income, and the cultural capital to interpret Africa to the rest of the world, all built on a foundation of looted artifacts.
So returning them means giving up that power.
By demanding the return of these objects, African nations are challenging the institutional authority of the West to be the sole curators of human achievement. The moral implications discussed in the texts are vast. Retaining stolen cultural heritage perpetuates the unequal power dynamic established by the original violence.
Okay, let's tie all of this together. We've looked at the math behind redrawing maps. We've looked at slapping Latin names on ancient botanical cures. We've looked at attributing massive stone cities to ghosts, hiding libraries full of calculus, and looting masterworks of metallurgy.
It's a long list.
It is. But all of these individual acts, they weren't isolated accidents. They weren't just a bunch of independent scholars making oopsies in their journals. They served a vital, unified purpose for the West. We need to look at the why: wealth, power, and the mythology of exclusive authorship.
This is where we must synthesize the historiography. What does Western civilization actually stand to lose by admitting the truth?
Right, what's the risk?
If we acknowledge the massive scale of African intellectual output, Europe doesn't lose its genuine achievements. The Greeks still had their philosophy. The Romans still built their aqueducts and statecraft. Europe still had the Renaissance and the Enlightenment.
Nobody's taking that away.
Exactly. What is lost is the mythology of exclusive authorship.
That false straight-line narrative. Greece to Rome, to Christian Europe, to modernity, all happening in a vacuum.
Right. That linear narrative conceals the massive, vibrant intellectual traffic connecting Europe with Egypt, North Africa, the Islamic world, and trans-Saharan African trade networks. Knowledge didn't move in a straight European line.
It never does.
It was a complex, messy, global web of borrowing, translating, and adapting. But acknowledging that interconnected web destroys the potent myth that Europe created modern civilization entirely by itself.
And there is a much darker, more urgent reason for maintaining that myth. We have to connect the erasure of African history to the moral defense of slavery and colonialism.
This is the absolute crux of the matter. European imperial powers claimed they were executing a civilizing mission. They framed themselves as bringing light to the dark continent, bringing order to chaos.
Right, the white savior complex.
But what happens to that moral defense when the societies you are invading and colonizing already possess diplomatic systems, commercial law, universities, complex metallurgical industries, advanced medicine, and sophisticated political traditions?
The defense completely collapses.
Yeah.
The civilizing mission is exposed as pure propaganda. It was just a mask for brutal, unvarnished extraction.
Precisely.
Because if you admit the people you are enslaving and subjugating are brilliant scholars, architects, and engineers, you are committing a blatant, undeniable crime against humanity. To justify the subjugation to your own citizens and your own conscience, you have to degrade the subject.
The sources force a very uncomfortable causal question upon the reader here. How much of modern Western development, wealth, and industrialization was directly financed through African dispossession?
I mean, the numbers are unimaginable.
We are talking about the immense wealth generated by enslaved African labor and the brutal extraction of gold, ivory, rubber, diamonds, copper, petroleum, and forced unequal trading relationships.
It's not that Europe mysteriously advanced while Africa mysteriously failed in a vacuum. Western accumulation was directly, inextricably tied to African extraction.
And to maintain that economic reality without facing complete moral collapse, the intellectual hierarchy underlying racism had to be strictly enforced across every discipline.
It had to be systematic.
Racial domination required a story that claimed Africans were naturally ahistorical, irrational, incapable of self-government, and biologically suited for colonial supervision. If African civilizations are recognized as prolific producers of philosophy, science, law, and international commerce, then the racial hierarchy becomes visibly political rather than natural.
It takes a lot of systemic effort to look at a continent producing steel, writing complex legal codes, performing brain surgery, and navigating international trade, and actively write a syllabus that says, nothing to see here.
It takes a massive institutional machine.
It must have been intellectually exhausting to maintain this historical lie for centuries. African intelligence wasn't just overlooked. It had to be actively, continuously denied day after day, textbook after textbook.
It was an active, deliberate denial. And the deepest truth revealed by synthesizing these sources is this: Africa was not excluded from the Western historical narrative because Africa lacked history.
Why was it excluded then?
Africa was excluded because the history it possessed directly contradicted the racial, economic, and moral story that Western power desperately needed to tell about itself to justify its dominance.
That is a profound synthesis. As we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to remind you, the listener, of what we set out to do. We wanted to look at the invisible machinery of history. Africa is not peripheral. It is central to the story of humanity, from the very emergence of our species to the enduring contributions in science, agriculture, and culture that shape the world you live in right now.
It changes everything when you see the whole picture.
It really does. Knowing this history doesn't just change how you view Africa, it changes how you view the institutions, the museums, the scientific journals, and the textbooks you interact with every single day.
And again, we want to reiterate that the insights we discussed today come directly from a shifting tide in global historiography. This isn't about pushing a modern political ideology. It's about the dedicated, rigorous work of international scholars reconstructing history from actual material evidence, archaeology, and indigenous knowledge, rather than relying solely on the biased, curated archives of colonial administrators.
Think back to our opening. We talked about how history isn't a clean X-ray with a clear binary diagnosis. It is a murky, muddy landscape, shaped heavily by power, perspective, and wealth.
And finding the bedrock beneath all that mud requires constant, active questioning. It requires us to look beyond the established labels on the map and ask who drew the lines.
So here's a final, lingering thought for you to take away. The next time you walk through the echoing halls of a prestigious museum, or the next time you open a foundational scientific textbook and look at a Latin botanical name or an ancient theorem, ask yourself this: whose brilliant ancestor is quietly sitting in the footnotes, waiting for their real name to be spoken? Think about how much hidden knowledge in your own daily life is simply waiting for a more honest historian.